Hello, listeners. Welcome to Ithihasa, an Indic history podcast. And you're listening to episode 18 of the season Vijayanagara. This is the seventh installment in the foundation series of this season. In the last episode, A Phoenix Rises, we followed the rise of Sangamas and the foundation of Vijayanagara. Just as Vijayanagara came out of the womb of destiny and took its first breath, its nemesis and arch rival, the Bahmani Kingdom, was being forged in the same fires of Deccan. Just as Vijayanagara is important to the history of the south, so is the Bahmani Kingdom for the Deccan. The Bahmani period covers a very important part of the history of medieval India. Its rise corresponds to the great turbulence and chaos that plagued the Deccan, especially during the spontaneous rebellions against the Tughluq overlords. Vijayanagara and Bahmanis were two sides of the same coin. Right from the moment of their birth, their swords and destinies were locked into each other. In light of that, I won't be doing justice to this season if I wasn't telling you the story of Bahmanis. It's a fascinating story indeed. The rise and fall of Bahmanis had a ripple effect on Vijayanagara's own fortunes, in ways it couldn't anticipate or predict. Interestingly, both the Bahmani and Vijayanagara rose almost at the same time, from the same conflicts with the same enemy, the Tughluqs. Though both their conflicts with Tughluqs were happening independently, the Hoysala-Vijayanagara-Varangal combination fought the Tughluqs in the south, and the Bahmanis fought them in the heart of Deccan. The primary sources that I have used to tell the story of Bahmanis are mainly three. The first one being an authoritative work, The Bahmanis of Deccan, by late Harun Khan Sherwani, published in 1946. Harun Khan was a distinguished Indian historian and a Padma Bhushan awardee. The next two sources are The History of Bahmani Dynasty by Major J.S. King, published in 1900s during the British Raj, and finally the work Bahman Shah by Dr. S.A.Q. Hussaini, published in 1960. We saw in the previous episodes how by the end of the second quarter of the 14th century, almost the whole of Indian subcontinent was under the despotic rule of the Tughluq Sultan Muhammad Bin Tughluq. The Khiljis from the north first set their foot in the Deccan during the end of the 13th century. As we saw in the previous foundation episodes, Alauddin Khilji's conquests were on shaky foundation, with constant banners of rebellions being raised against him. And the Tughluqs had to subjugate the Deccan all over again after the fall of Khiljis. It was only during the Tughluqs' rule that the entire of Deccan and the south were systematically conquered. The modern warfare techniques and blitzkrieg style of Tughluqs and Khiljis were partly responsible for catching each of the four kingdoms off guard in their encounters. Not to mention their lack of unity, which came in a bit too late for them. As we saw earlier, it wasn't until Veera Bhallala decided to unite many of these bickering forces to put up a fight against the genocidal Islamic onslaught. It was after that the tide began to turn against the Tughluqs in the south. And this tide was also aided by yet another tide in the Deccan, which came in the form of Bahmanis. Just as the Tughluqs thought that they had gained a strong foothold, they were washed away by both these tides, first from the south and then the Deccan. With it, the Tughluqs were effectively cut off from the half of the country and had to fall back to Delhi, abandoning their new capital of Daulatabad. Having said that, the Tughluq influence on the Deccan and the south was very much visible, and especially in the Deccan. Many monuments in the great rocky citadel of Daulatabad, the dome at Beed in Maharashtra, inscriptions in Bodhan and Hyderabad, the Naskh script in which the Tughluq court language of Persian was written found its way into the Bahmani Sultanate too. The sloppy walls supporting the semicircular dome, in typical Tughlaq style too, left its mark on the Deccan. And finally, the system of government and administration of the Tughlaqs too was initially adopted by the Bahmanis, and only reformed in the 15th century to slow down the decay and rot that had set in by then. A bit too late though for the Bahmanis. Clearly, the impact of Tughlaqs was significant on both the Deccan and the Bahmanis. Before we can understand the rise of Bahmanis, we need to understand the fall of Tughlaqs. After all, one empire's loss is another's gain. And to understand the fall, we need to look at aspects of the Tughlaq administration and policies a bit closely. In the previous foundation episodes, I'd mentioned the acts of religious persecution, plunder and pillage by the Khiljis and Tughlaqs. While this in itself had grown a lot of resentment amongst the Deccan and southern population, I have to point out how the Tughlaq economic and administrative policies too added fuel to the fire, ultimately bringing down the whole Tughlaq edifice in Deccan and South. And hence, it's important for us to first look at the administrative setup of Tughlaq government. The Tughlaqs had dominated almost the whole of country, starting from Delhi to Madurai. The whole empire of Tughlaqs was divided into 23 administrative domains. Of these 23 domains, the regions of Jajnagar, modern-day Orissa, Marhat, modern-day Maharashtra, Tilanga, modern-day Telangana, Bidar, Kampili, Dwarasamudra and Malwa were considered as the southern part of the empire. The Tughlaq Empire had two capitals effectively. One was the old capital in Delhi and the new capital in Devagiri, also named as Daulatabad. During the first half of Muhammad Bin Tughlaq's reign, he supposedly had a good control over his domains, fully dominating it both from military and administrative standpoint. Ziauddin Barani details in his chronicles how every time a new territory was added to the Tughlaq Empire, a hierarchy of officials were sent to this new domain to administer it. Even the farthest of the domains were kept under control with the help of them, while the tributes and regular taxes were carted off to the central treasury in the thousand-pillar palace built by Khilji in Delhi. There was a pyramidal governance structure in the provinces to rule them effectively. Each province had a governor at the top who reported to the Sultan in Delhi and sent him men, taxes and the share of wealth from the provinces. And due to the long distances between the provinces and the capital of Delhi, far off in the north, the provincial governors were given significant autonomy in their decision-making to make it easier to administer and maintain order. These governors had their own revenue officials, nobility, ministries, divans, and army divisions under their direct command. The governor too had a large patronage of office allotted to him, and while other higher posts were appointed directly by the reigning sultan, the rest of the posts were directly appointed by the governor without any interference from the sultan at the capital. With this, we can see that a great latitude was given to these provincial governors. But there was one position that was really interesting and peculiar. It's called Amiran-e-Sada, and they reported to the governor. The officers holding this position were mostly of noble descent or belonged to the upper middle class. And they were in direct contact with the people over whom they held sway. These officers were the bridge between the provincial governor and the people. And by transitive property, they were the only bridge between the sultan and the people. The people experienced governance and the sultan's rule through their interactions with these officers. So it's no wonder that these officers developed an innate pride of office and began to show a level of dignity and arrogance against their overlords. in many administrative matters, which they undoubtedly knew better due to their experience with the people of the empire. And when Muhammad bin Tughluq finally had enough of their self-importance, he decides to crack his whip with a targeted policy to suppress them. And to find a reason to punish these officials, he makes them a scapegoat for the rebellions in Deccan and South, which, to be honest, most of them were not even directly or indirectly responsible for. While the causes for the rebellions against the Tughluqs were many, but the spark for the Deccan's attempt to break away started from unexpected quarters, at least from Muhammad bin Tughluq's perspective. The spark was a character we already saw a few times in the previous Foundation episodes. It was the Sultan's maternal cousin who held a Jagir in Sagar, Bahauddin Gharshasp, who had either rebelled against Muhammad Tughluq or was set up as one by his rivals at the court. Either way, he became enemy number one in the eyes of the Tughluq Sultan and ended up becoming a fugitive after losing a battle near Devagiri against Sultan's commanders Jahan Malik Ahmad Ayaz and Mujiruddin Avi Rija. We saw in one of the previous Foundation episodes, The Ashes of Kampili, how Bahauddin Gharshasp fled to Kampili and Kampiladeva had offered him protection, leading to an epic showdown between Tughluqs and Kampili, leading to the fall of Kampili, and finally ending with the Hoysala ruler Veera Bhallala surrendering the fugitive Gharshasp to Muhammad bin Tughluq. We won't go in depth into this again. For those who are interested for a full backstory, please do listen to the Foundation episode Ashes of Kampili. So the effect that this rebellion and initial success of Bahauddin Gharshasp had was that it convinced the Sultan, Muhammad bin Tughluq, that it was necessary to have a capital situated in a position more central than Delhi. He consulted his advisors, the members of Arbab-e-Dawal or Advisory Council at Delhi. And after some discussion, the two cities of Ujjain and Devagiri were chosen as the candidates for the new capital. But Devagiri ended up being chosen as a new capital, and it was initially renamed as Quwwatul Islam, and then it was changed to Daulatabad. With the new Tughluq capital chosen, Muhammad bin Tughluq ordered his entire population, court, administration, and nobility to uproot themselves from Delhi and migrate to Daulatabad. The wealth, comforts, and prestige of Devagiri increased by leaps and bounds overnight with this move. Though it's important to note that Hindus of Delhi didn't migrate to it and instead chose to remain there itself. Interestingly, the Hindus in Delhi and Hindus in Daulatabad ended up becoming even richer. The Hindus in Delhi now were free of the Tughluq interference. The Hindus of Daulatabad had immense wealth from Delhi, transferred to them indirectly with the capital being moved there. The idea underlying the decision to move the capital seems to have been that the Sultan would go to the new capital at certain intervals, and a large number of reliable officers and nobility would be stationed there so that the vast Tughluq Empire may have a powerful organization right in the heart of the Deccan, on which the empire could depend. Delhi still remained one of the two capitals of the empire, with its vast Hindu population and a continuous influx of Muslim immigrants from beyond the northwestern frontiers, which Daulatabad could not hope for. Little did the Sultan realize that the very Amirs whom he was transplanting from the traditional capital of India to a city 1,000 miles away would play a crucial role in shaking up the foundations of the Tughluq Empire and leading to the independence of the Deccan, which was to last for 3.5 centuries. The 20 years between 1327 AD the year of the establishment of Daulatabad, and 1347 AD, the date of the proclamation of the independence of the Deccan, may be divided in two distinct periods. During the first period, 1327 to 1341 AD, there was some semblance of peace in South India, and the new capital of Daulatabad turned into a safe haven for security and wealth. The idea of a second capital during this period was a great success, and the policy of establishing a large and loyal population there was supposedly bearing a fruit. The Sultan was constantly on the march from Daulatabad to Delhi and vice versa. In 1328 AD, which is the same year Company fell, he even went to the northern capital for a couple of years in order to suppress rebellions in the northwestern provinces. Not only was the Deccan perfectly quiet during the period of his absence, but even the northern rebellions were quelled without much effort. And there was an appearance of peace and calm in the empire, as recorded even by Ibn Battuta in 1333 AD. But Tughluqs had no inkling that this was a lull before the storm, and it will be this storm that will wash away the whole of Muhammad bin Tughluq's empire from under his feet even before he has a chance to react. It so happened that while the Sultan was on the way from Warangal to Daulatabad, it was rumored that he had fallen ill and succumbed to his illness. This incited an Amir Malik Hoshang, son of Kamaluddin Gurg, to revolt. However, it turned out that the Sultan was fine and healthy, and Sultan's army gives this rebel a chase and is forced to surrender to the Tughluq general Tughluq Khan, who had now been appointed as the viceroy of Daulatabad. After the appointment of Tughluq Khan and Nusrat Khan for administering the province of Telangana in Bidar, the Sultan left for Lahore in the northwest to suppress yet another rebellion. And soon, Muhammad bin Tughluq realized that his idea of having a central capital in the heart of Deccan was not a totally pragmatic one. He concluded that the main cause of the unqualified success of the Mabar revolt, as well as the ever-recurring rebellions in the Deccan and South, was the belligerent behavior of those very Amirs whom he had sent to Daulatabad. And when he left for the north, he gave orders that those who had been directed to migrate to the south should now re-migrate to the north. In the 1335 AD, after suppressing the revolt in Lahore, Muhammad bin Tughluq headed south again to suppress the nascent Mabar revolt by Sayyid Ahsan of Kaital, which is in Punjab. The author of the Mabar revolt was the father of Sayyid Ibrahim, the purse bearer of the Sultan, and had been appointed as the provincial governor of the Mabar or the Coromandel region with Madurai as a capital earlier. Sayyid Ahsan joined hands with a faction of nobility in Daulatabad, which had been earlier forced to migrate to the new capital. These nobles now refused to move back to Delhi, fearing their obvious loss of influence and prestige. The division of the army that the Sultan had sent to suppress them ended up joining the cause of the rebels instead. And so the Sultan was forced to march against Mabar rebels himself. He intended to proceed to Madurai by the way of Warangal, but coincidentally there was an epidemic that was raging there. The Sultan himself gets infected with it and falls ill. This forces him to return to Daulatabad, leaving his proxy, Nayab Wazir Malik Maqbul. The Mabar rebellion was followed by the rebellion in Warangal. And at the same time, Harihara and Bukka were taking baby steps in establishing their dominance in the Carnatic under the umbrella of Hoysala's Veerabhallala, like we saw in the last few episodes. After the fall of Kampili, the proxy governor Malik Makbul had to face the opposition of the local Hindu chieftains, one of whom we saw earlier, Krishna Nayak, or also known as Kapaiya Nayak, saw the impending fall of the Tughlaqs, and he rose up in rebellion to drive out Malik Makbul from Warangal. If you remember, Krishna Nayak had also attended the grand meeting of Veerabhallala along with Harihara, like we saw in the earlier episode, as revealed by the Chitradurga inscription. In this connection, I have to point out that the historian Harun Khan Sherwani claims that Harihara was earlier in a pro-Tughlaq faction and had been appointed as a governor of Bellari sometime in between 1327 to 1344 AD. And it seems Harihara switched sides and went over to the Hoysala side, as per Harun Khan Sherwani's claim. While we explored this angle in the previous episode and found it on a weaker footing, but what is interesting is Harun Khan makes no claim of Harihara and Bukka being converted to Islam and then turning into apostates. Like we saw previously, he doesn't, because it's a baseless narrative. And Harun's omission only bolsters that argument. Either way, Krishna Nayaka, Veerabhallala, Harihara, and Bukka form an alliance, unite against the Tughlaqs down south, and throw off its yoke. With this, a new political alignment had formed in the south, and Tughlaqs effectively lost all the territories in that region. By this point, the only territories which were still under Tughlaqs were the regions of Western Deccan and Daulatabad. So with the deep south liberated from Tughlaqs, it was now the time for the Deccan proper to liberate itself. Its first attempt for independence came in the form of a rebellion by Nusrat Khan, whom we saw earlier as being appointed as a governor of Telangana, ruling from Bidar. Nusrat Khan had refused to send the stipulated 1 lakh of tankas to the Sultan's treasury and proclaimed himself as a king. This rebel was quickly defeated by the Viceroy of Daulatabad, Tughluq Khan, and he was sent as a prisoner to Delhi. The next Deccan insurrection was a rebellion of Ali Shah in 1340 AD. Ali Shah was the nephew of Zafar Khan, who was the previous viceroy of the dead Alauddin Khilji. Ali Shah was sent by the viceroy Tughluq Khan to Gulbarga to collect taxes. Instead of carrying out the orders, he proclaimed himself as a king at Dharur and was joined by his 3 brothers, Hassan Gangu, Ahmad, and Muhammad. Remember the name Hassan Gangu, it's going to be important. They 3 kill a local officer who was one of the most trusted confidants of the Sultan Muhammad Bin Tughluq, and they captured the city of Sagar, which was a stronghold of Bidar. But then this victory was short-lived, after Tughluq Khan defeats Malik Shah at Dharur and drives him out of Bidar. He then arrests Malik Shah, and the Sultan had him exiled to his ancestral home in Ghazni. In this way, Tughluq Khan was very loyal and invaluable to the Sultan in suppressing the last 2 serious rebellions in the Deccan. The last rebellion convinces Muhammad bin Tughluq that there was something inherently wrong in his system of government. It was the cream of the old nobility whom he had sent from Delhi to the distant parts of his empire that were proving to be the chief culprits. In the Deccan and Madurai, these nobles were the cause of all the troubles and rebellions. Reflecting on all of this, the Sultan decides to take an extreme step of replacing the entire nobility across his empire with a new nobility that came from a poor background with a lowly parentage, composed of people who were Sultan's own puppets and entirely under his thumb. This policy, along with the changing the capital multiple times, are very radical steps for any age. And at that time, it was something no other ruler before him had even dared to attempt. This policy, especially of replacing the nobility, was on the same lines as his radical policy of issuing token currency across his empire. Both these decisions of his shake the foundations of Tughluq Empire. And it is important that we take a quick detour to understand Muhammad bin Tughluq's token currency system that had a far-reaching impact on the health of his empire and the role it played in the independence of Deccan. And here we will end this episode, in which we saw the beginning of the end of Tughluqs and the impact of Muhammad bin Tughluq's foolhardy policies, which indirectly led to the Deccan Amirs rebelling against the Tughluq overlords. We will continue this story in the next episode and also look at the birth of Bahmanis. I sincerely hope the listeners enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please hit the subscribe button and leave a rating and a review wherever it is that you are listening. A huge thank you for taking the time to listen to the show. I hope to see you soon in the next episode. Till then, this is Narendra Vikram, your host and narrator, signing off. Hope you have a great week ahead.